We often speak of sporting victories as moments of pure, unadulterated joy, but what if the greatest triumph of a career was also the most profound agony? What price truly must a champion pay for immortality? For the man known simply as the Hawk, the path to glory was paved not with lush fairway grass, but with broken glass and shattered bone. It was February of 1949 when a Greyhound bus, traveling at speed, collided head-on with the car carrying Ben and his wife Valerie. In a split-second decision that saved his wife's life, Hogan threw himself across the passenger seat. The impact was devastating. He sustained a double fracture of the pelvis, a fractured collarbone, and life-threatening blood clots. 15 months later, defying every medical prognosis, Hogan stood on the first tee box of the US Open 1950 at Merion, Pennsylvania. The concept of Ben Hogan superism, overcoming the unsurmountable, was about to be tested under the harshest scrutiny the gentleman's game could offer. This was not merely a return, it was a physical war waged against his own compromised body. Hogan's recovery was incomplete. His circulation was so poor that walking 18 holes was a grueling, agonizing task, constantly risking further clots. This was the silent internal drama of the competition, not merely driving the ball straight, but enduring the sheer physical torture of every single step. Beneath the immaculate tailoring of his golf trousers, his legs were tightly wrapped, bound in heavy elastic bandages, a painful necessity following the severe damage sustained in the accidente Ben Hogan. The sight of him, pale and drawn, yet hitting the ball with that familiar, almost machine-like precision, stunned the galleries. As the tournament reached its climax, the pressure mounted, forcing Hogan into an 18-hole playoff against Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio. The question was no longer about skill, but about stamina. Could his ravaged legs withstand the equivalent of 5 full rounds? This perhaps is the truest definition of a Vittoria Dolorosa golf, a truly painful victory, a legend demanding triumph even when his body pleaded for rest. Before we delve into the details of the infamous playoff, tell us, have you ever witnessed a sporting performance defined more by sheer endurance through suffering than by pure, flawless skill? Comment your thoughts below. We return to Merion after the break. Merion Golf Club, June 1950. The air was thick not just with the Pennsylvania humidity, but with a tension rarely seen on a major championship Sunday. This was not a contest of skill alone. It was a referendum on human endurance. The gallery, usually boisterous and lively, moved with a hushed reverence, witnessing a drama that stretched far beyond the confines of the fairway. Just 16 months prior, Ben Hogan, the game's most precise technician, the Hawk, had faced mortality on a lonely Texas highway. A head-on collision with a Greyhound bus had shattered his pelvis, collarbone, and, most critically, nearly destroyed his legs, leaving him with lifelong circulatory issues. Doctors had questioned if he would ever walk again, let alone swing a golf club competitively. The prevailing wisdom was that his career was over. The sheer physical demand of the professional game was now an impossibility. Yet, here he was. The golf world watched in stunned silence, divided between admiration and apprehension. Hogan was back, yes, but he was a shadow of his former self beneath the impenetrable exterior of his steely gaze. Every step on that historic turf was an act of profound, calculated will. His legs, wrapped tightly in bandages and supported by custom-made compression garments to manage the perilous blood clot risk, struggled desperately to circulate blood, a condition so severe that playing 36 holes in a single day, as the US Open demanded of its finalists, was medically irresponsible. In an era before motorized carts were even considered, the final 2 rounds of the US Open were played back-to-back, 36 holes. For most competitors, it was a brutal test of stamina. For Hogan, it was a calculation of survival. He wasn't just hitting the ball, he was managing his body's ticking clock. His legendary swing, compact, powerful, repeatable, was forced to compensate for the instability below the knees. It's a testament to his mental fortitude that his ball striking remained pristine, even as the blood flow diminished and the agony intensified. He had to hit the ball exactly where he intended, because the physical cost of walking an extra yard into the deep rough or bending to retrieve a ball from an awkward lie was astronomical. Every shot was a conservation effort. As the final round drew to a close, a miraculous scenario unfolded. Despite the crippling pain, Hogan was tied with 2 formidable challengers, Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio. He stood on the 18th tee, knowing a par was required to force an 18-hole playoff the following day. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, the pain radiating up through his torso, threatening to break his famous stoicism. Hogan's approach shot on the 18th green at Merion is one of the most celebrated moments in the game's history. Facing a long, difficult carry into a headwind, he famously pulled the one iron, the club of choice for the boldest technicians, requiring absolute commitment, and struck a ball that pierced the wind, finding the heart of the green perfectly. He two-putted for par. The roar from the gallery was not just for the score, but for the sheer scale of the comeback, recognizing the man who refused to be defeated by fate. But the battle was far from over. Hogan had forced the playoff, but he had spent every ounce of his physical reserves. His legs were screaming. Yet he returned the next day, summoning a performance that defied medical logic. While Fazio and Mangrum struggled to maintain pace, Hogan shot a masterclass 69, securing the championship by 4 strokes. It was the most heroic victory in the history of the game, cementing his reputation not just as a champion, but as an icon of unwavering resilience. And there is one more detail you wouldn't imagine about this legendary moment of resilience. After that triumphant, agonizing playoff victory, a champion is usually whisked away to celebration and recognition. But due to the catastrophic damage to Hogan's circulatory system, the same damage that almost cost him his life, the doctors absolutely forbade him from flying. The change in pressure and the required immobility in an airplane cabin were deemed too great a risk for blood clots. The champion, having conquered the US Open and overcome death itself, could not fly home immediately. He had to endure a grueling multi-day train ride back to Texas, still wrapped in his compression garments, unable to fully celebrate the monumental feat he had just accomplished. The champion, having conquered the US Open, was temporarily conquered by his own compromised biology. The 1950 US Open was not merely a trophy added to Hogan's immaculate collection. It was the definitive statement of the man himself, a testament to that unique, almost frightening dedication to perfection that defined the Hawk. He taught us that true victory is often found not in the absence of pain, but in the decision to play through it, step by agonizing step, until the final putt drops. He remains the quintessential example of the gentleman's game, demanding the highest price from its greatest practitioners. For more stories of the grit and glory that define this ancient sport, stories whispered around the 19th hole, consider joining us again. We'll see you at the next tee. It is a common refrain in our sport. The pursuit of the perfect swing, the quest for immortality etched onto the trophy. But sometimes the greatest triumph is simply the act of walking the final fairway. The year was 1950. The venue, the venerable Merion Golf Club outside Philadelphia. The air was thick, not just with the humidity of a Pennsylvania summer, but with a palpable sense of medical impossibility. 9 months prior, Ben Hogan, the greatest ball striker of his generation, had been involved in a catastrophic head-on collision with a Greyhound bus in Texas. His body was a mosaic of fractures, a broken pelvis, a fractured collarbone, a crushed ankle, and near-fatal blood clots that required emergency surgery. Doctors had fought to save his life. Few believed he would ever walk without a cane, let alone return to competitive golf. Hogan's presence at Merion was, therefore, not merely an entry on a leaderboard. It was a profound act of defiance against mortality itself. The physical toll was evident with every step. The doctors had fused parts of his pelvic structure, severely limiting the rotation and torque that define a powerful modern swing. To counteract the inevitable swelling and pain, Hogan wore heavy compression bandages beneath his trousers, a corset of cotton and elastic holding his damaged legs together. This was not golf played for pleasure. This was a surgical march across 7,000 yards of unforgiving terrain. Hogan's legendary stoicism, that almost frightening intensity known as the Hawk, was never more necessary. He couldn't rely on brute strength. The pain prohibited it. Instead, he relied on the most repeatable, precise action the game had ever witnessed. His swing became a clockwork mechanism, driven entirely by the arms and shoulders, minimizing the treacherous rotation of his lower body. It was a masterclass in biomechanical adaptation. He was playing 4 rounds of golf, yes, but living 4 days of acute, relentless physical punishment. As the tournament reached its agonizing conclusion on Sunday afternoon, the narrative became less about score and more about survival. The Merion course, demanding precision and punishing fatigue, began to take its final, inevitable toll. Hogan had faded slightly, but his grit kept him within striking distance of the leaders, Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio. He arrived at the 72nd hole, the 18th, needing a par to force an 18-hole playoff the following day. The hole demanded a long, precise approach shot. He reached into his bag and pulled out the 1-iron. For those unfamiliar with this archaic instrument, the 1-iron is the blade of least loft, the club that separates the virtuoso from the merely proficient. It demands absolute perfection of contact. At that moment, under that pressure, with his body screaming in protest, Hogan struck the ball with a purity that defied the gravity of his circumstances. The ball soared, settled firmly on the green, and the subsequent two-putt secured the tie. The Monday playoff was less a golf match and more an exhibition of sheer psychological dominance. While Mangrum and Fazio succumbed to the pressure of the US Open stage, Hogan, who had already conquered death, methodically dismantled the course, winning by 4 strokes. It was arguably the most painful victory in the history of the sport, a testament to the unyielding nature of a champion. This victory redefined courage in golf. It established the benchmark for comeback stories, proving that the mind could override the most severe limitations of the flesh. The myth of Ben Hogan, the great ball striker, was permanently superseded by the legend of Ben Hogan, the invincible competitor. And there is one more detail you cannot imagine. The intense chronic swelling in his legs meant that every evening, after the adrenaline finally subsided, the pain was so excruciating that he would often lie awake for hours. He played the US Open, the toughest test in golf, knowing that the agony would only truly subside when he was horizontal and the bandages were removed, temporarily offering relief to the damaged veins and tissues. He was not just battling the field, he was managing a life-threatening medical condition while pursuing glory. Hogan's 1950 US Open transcended sport. It was a narrative of resurrection, proving that the human spirit, when properly focused, can conquer the physical limits of the body, a moment etched forever in the annals of Merion. For the rest of the champions, the fight is against par. For Hogan, the fight was against oblivion. For more stories that capture the true spirit and history of this gentleman's game, consider joining us again. We will see you at the next tee. It is June 1950. The setting is the venerable Merion Golf Club in Ardmore, Pennsylvania. The sun beats down with a heavy summer intensity, baking the pristine fairways and quickening the already treacherous greens. The US Open, the national championship, the ultimate test of the game, is underway. But this year the focus is not merely on the pursuit of silver and glory, but on the profound, almost biblical journey of one man, Ben Hogan. 16 months earlier, on a cold, fog-laden highway in Texas, Hogan's life had been utterly shattered. A head-on collision with a Greyhound bus left him with a litany of catastrophic injuries: a fractured collarbone, a shattered ankle, broken ribs, and a pelvis fractured in 2 places. His doctors were candid. The mere act of walking again was optimistic. A return to competitive golf was deemed impossible. Yet here he was. The stoic, legendary Hawk was back on the hallowed grounds of the US Open, defying medical science and the very laws of physical endurance. The story of the 1950 Open is not a chronicle of brilliant birdies, but a painful meditation on human will. Hogan's walk was agonizing. Each step was a controlled explosion of discomfort, managed only by sheer force of character. He could not bend properly. The rotational power usually generated by a champion's lower body was simply unavailable. His legs, encased in elastic stockings and heavy bandages to combat the persistent threat of fatal blood clots, were monuments to scar tissue and pain. He was playing the game of golf, yes, but he was simultaneously fighting a silent internal war against his own compromised physiology. To understand the magnitude of this feat, one must appreciate the sheer physical demand of a 72-hole championship. A professional golfer walks roughly 5 miles per round. Over 4 days, Hogan was forcing his reconstructed frame to cover 20 miles, all while maintaining the exquisite balance and precision required to compete at the highest level. He compensated with an almost superhuman reliance on his timing and upper body. The famously flat, repeating swing, which had already made him a titan before the accident, became even more compact, more ruthlessly efficient. He had learned to play golf entirely from the waist up, sacrificing power for absolute control. Every shot was a victory of mind over matter. As the tournament reached its inevitable dramatic conclusion on Sunday, the strain was visible. Hogan, never one to show weakness, was clearly laboring. He was tied with Lloyd Mangrum and George Fazio at 287 strokes, forcing an 18-hole playoff the following day. It was an extra round, an extra 5 miles, that his body simply did not possess the reserves for. And there is one detail more, perhaps the cruelest irony, that few outside his inner circle could ever truly grasp. During the tournament, Hogan was forced to sleep in a warm bath. The pain was so intense, the muscular spasms so debilitating, that submerging his body was the only way to achieve temporary respite from the relentless throbbing. He was literally resting between rounds in the manner of a marathon runner, attempting to soothe ravaged muscles. Only his were ravaged by trauma, not training. The true moment of immortality arrived not during the playoff, but during the final hole of the regulation 72. Hogan stood on the 18th tee, needing a par to tie the lead and secure his spot in the Monday playoff. The hole at Merion demands precision, 250 yards, often into the wind. Hogan pulled the club that defined his career, the 1-iron. It is a club today rarely seen even in the bags of the game's finest ball strikers, long, unforgiving, demanding perfection. For Hogan, under this pressure, playing on legs that felt like crumbling concrete, the decision was audacious. He struck the ball with that familiar, almost surgical precision. The ball soared long and low, settling perfectly on the green. The resulting photograph, Hogan holding the club aloft, the concentration etched deep into his features, the ball already gone, is arguably the most iconic image in the history of the sport, a frozen depiction of unyielding fortitude. It was the shot of a lifetime, executed by a man whose life had nearly ended just over a year before. On the Monday playoff, exhausted but resolute, Hogan's focus did not waver. He dispatched Fazio and Mangrum, winning by 4 and 6 strokes respectively. This was not merely a US Open trophy. This was the ultimate testament to the human spirit's capacity for recovery. Ben Hogan, the survivor, had returned to the pinnacle of the gentleman's game, proving that courage, when combined with dedication, can truly conquer the physical boundaries of existence. He had, quite literally, walked through the shadow of death and emerged a champion. It is a victory that resonates down the ages, a benchmark against which all future comebacks are measured. Who witnessed it, or who has since studied the magnitude of his suffering, understands that the 1950 US Open was the most difficult and perhaps the most important victory ever recorded on American soil. For more stories of the grit and grace that define this beautiful game, consider joining us on the next chapter of golf's enduring legacy. We shall see you on the next tee. Merion Golf Club, 1950. The air in Ardmore, Pennsylvania was thick with expectation, yet heavier still with a profound, almost reverent silence. This was not the usual hush of competitive pressure. This was the quiet surrounding a potential miracle. The man walking the perimeter of the green, his gait measured, almost mechanical, was Ben Hogan. Just 16 months prior, a Greyhound bus had collided head-on with his Cadillac near Van Horn, Texas. The damage was catastrophic. A double fracture of the pelvis, a shattered collarbone, crushed ribs, and life-threatening blood clots that nearly cost him his life on the operating table. Surgeons had fought to save his existence, not his career. They estimated he might never walk a full 18 holes without severe difficulty. Yet here he was, standing on the most hallowed ground in American golf, competing for the US Open, the championship he regarded as the truest measure of a player's worth. The conflict was not between Hogan and the field, but between Hogan and the relentless, searing agony beneath his immaculate trousers. The medical reality of his participation defies sporting logic. To complete 72 holes of championship golf demands unparalleled physical conditioning, especially at the relentless pace of a major. Hogan's legs, permanently damaged and prone to clotting, were wrapped tightly in elastic bandages from ankle to thigh, a second skin designed not for support, but simply to keep the blood flowing, fighting the constant threat of collapse. The great sports writers of the era noted the almost excruciating effort of the simplest movement. Every step up the fairway was a negotiation with pain, but Hogan, the Hawk, was defined by his almost inhuman stoicism. He never flinched. He simply focused on the task at hand, the flight of the ball, the geometry of the course. His swing, that famously repeatable, beautiful engine of power and precision, had to be adapted. He could no longer rely on the explosive rotation of his lower body, a foundation necessary for modern power. Instead, the requisite speed and stability came from his hands and the sheer, unyielding torque of his upper torso. It was a masterpiece of compensatory mechanics, a triumph of mind over matter, over the 4 arduous days. As the tournament progressed into the Sunday back nine, The drama reached a fever pitch. Hogan was tied with the leaders, Lloyd Mangrum and Fazio, but the physical debt was coming due. The pain was visible only in the way he held his putter handle after impact, leaning on it momentarily, desperate for a few seconds of relief before taking the next agonizing step. It came down to the 72nd hole, Merion's 18th, a notorious par 4. Hogan needed a par to force an 18-hole playoff. He found the green, but left himself a testing, sweeping 30-foot putt. The tension was suffocating. The gallery, usually vocal, seemed to hold its collective breath, understanding the gravity of the man's struggle. He addressed the ball. A long pause, the concentration absolute. The putt was struck with precision. It tracked the break, slowed, and settled 3 feet short of the hole. A manageable distance, but after 4 days of this monumental physical and mental exertion, nothing was guaranteed. Hogan stepped up. The ball disappeared, par. The moment was not marked by a wild, euphoric celebration, but by a heavy, exhausted sigh of relief. He had survived. The next day, in the unforgiving 18-hole playoff, Hogan would summon one last incredible reserve, shooting 69 to win by 4 strokes. This was not merely a victory of skill. It was a profound statement on the limits of human endurance. Hogan did not just return to the game, he returned to dominate it, turning unimaginable agony into an unmatched legacy of sheer grit. He proved that character is not defined by how you play when you are healthy, but by what you can accomplish when the body itself betrays the will. The enduring image of Ben Hogan, standing victorious yet utterly depleted, reminds us that the greatest trophies are often forged not in effortless brilliance, but in the crucible of suffering. It remains perhaps the most painful victory in the history of the gentleman's game, a testament that while the body may be fragile, the spirit of a champion is unbreakable. If these chronicles of golfing glory and sheer determination resonate with you, do consider subscribing and sharing your memories of the Hawk in the comments below. We shall see you at the next tee.